The lifestyles that we are living at the moment are creating perfect conditions for cortisol levels to rise. And what do I mean by this? Well, many people are not getting enough sleep due to stress and busy schedules, high uses of screens and electronics before bed. Our diets are highly processed and high in salt, sugar, unhealthy fats. We also tend to consume more caffeine. We aren't exercising enough, we're lonely, and we're obsessed with productivity to the point where having time to yourself and actually being able to relax is seen as a problem and a failure of some sort. And what do all of these things lead to? Elevated cortisol levels. Now look, I am probably exaggerating a teeny bit. This isn't everyone's lifestyle, but everything I have just said is pretty normalized, and I'm sure a few people watching this can relate to at least one of the things that I've just said. So today I wanted to go through what exactly can happen to your body when cortisol levels remain high for too long, because it does impact on your health. And if you find that you're experiencing any of the things that I'm about to mention in this video, then maybe you need to make some changes to your lifestyle. So let's go. We first need to understand what cortisol is before we get into what it's doing to our bodies. And I have done a video of this in the past, so I will link that in the description if you are wanting a more in-depth explanation. But cortisol is simply a steroid hormone. It's made in our adrenal glands, and one of the reasons it gets released from these glands is in response to stress. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a need for cortisol. There is actually a natural daily rhythm that all of us have where cortisol will usually peak in the morning to wake us up and make sure we have enough energy to go through the day, and then it will decline throughout the day as time goes on, and this pattern is very important for body functioning. This rhythm is of course known as the circadian rhythm, and all of the things that I mentioned in the start of this video, poor sleep, lack of exercise, stress, poor nutrition, all of these things can disrupt this cycle and keep your cortisol levels elevated. And that is where problems can arise. So one of the main things that elevated cortisol levels can do is impact on your metabolic health. This can lead to weight gain, and this is because cortisol promotes fat storage, particularly around your abdomen area, and abdominal fat can contribute to increased waist circumference. If your waist circumference becomes too high, it does become a health risk. But the reason cortisol promotes fat storage is because it causes the release of glucose into your blood. And it does this because if cortisol is high, your body thinks there is a stressful situation that you're in, and if that was the case, you would be requiring some energy to deal with the stressful situation. And so cortisol actually very kindly gives you glucose, which normally your body would use for energy. But when you have elevated cortisol levels, it's more of a chronic situation. You aren't in a stressful situation that needs energy for you to get out of. You're just chronically stressed. You don't actually need that glucose. And so when your blood glucose levels rise, insulin will also rise, and insulin encourages fat storage. So any fat that you're consuming from your diet, it's going to get stored rather than used for energy, and as a result, you can gain some weight. So cortisol itself as well promotes fat storage because, again, your body thinks you're in a stressful situation, so it will want to hoard energy in case it needs it in the future. This isn't something that happens straight away. It's something that very slowly happens over time, and all of a sudden people realize they may have gained a little bit of weight without even noticing it because it's just been happening very, very slowly over time as you've been in this chronically elevated state with your cortisol. So along with weight gain, blood sugar levels can rise, and that's because of what I just said. Cortisol makes your liver release any glucose that is stored away. And again, over time, this can lead to insulin resistance and increased blood sugar levels, which leads to type 2 diabetes. Now, there is one more thing to do with metabolism that cortisol does, and that is reduce muscle mass, which, if you have seen any of my past videos, is something that you want to avoid. Now, the reason this can happen is, again, just think about what cortisol is usually for. Very acute, stressful situations. Think your fight or flight response, running away from a lion or something. Energy is going to be the priority in this case, and that is going to be cortisol's main goal. And so it even breaks down muscle so that it can reuse the material to produce energy instead. This wouldn't be an issue if it was just a one-time thing. But again, elevated cortisol is a chronic condition and it goes on, and so you can lose muscle mass and even experience weakness, fatigue. It makes the situation a bit worse. And this is something you don't want, especially as you are aging, because as I've said, you lose muscle mass naturally as you age. Having elevated cortisol levels can speed this process up. So that's what can happen with your metabolism. Another area that cortisol heavily impacts on is your cardiovascular health. So I'm talking about your heart and your arteries. It can cause high blood pressure and it can cause damage to your arteries. Again, once you know what cortisol is usually used for, you start to understand all the issues that it can cause. If you're in that stressful situation, your heart rate and your blood pressure goes up. And the reason it does this is to pump more blood around your body so that all your muscles can receive more blood and use the oxygen that's in that blood to move around and be used in case they're needed. But if this is a chronic issue, this can lead to hypertension, because the last thing you want is a sustained elevated heart rate and blood pressure. Now, moving on to your brain and mental health, it should be no surprise that elevated cortisol can lead to anxiety and depression. So high cortisol levels interrupt the balance of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. Now, these are very important for regulating your mood. And people with elevated cortisol can find themselves feeling a little bit more anxious, irritable, or depressed. And the issue with this is that anxiety causes cortisol spikes as well. So what you do is end up being in a little bit of a cycle where your anxiety causes the cortisol elevation, which then goes on to cause anxiety, which then can cause increases to cortisol. And this becomes a very difficult cycle to break. It's the same thing with sleep. Poor sleep increases your cortisol, and then high cortisol causes poor sleep. Now, there is also some evidence out there to suggest that if you have long-term elevated cortisol levels, it can cause the hippocampus, which is a region in your brain that's needed for memory and learning, to actually shrink. And this causes issues with memory and cognitive function. So definitely not something to ignore and something to keep in mind, because that will become a problem again with aging. Now, I just wanted to move on to the digestive system because it's maybe less of a focus when people are talking about cortisol. If your body has high cortisol, it's focusing on getting you energy and immediate survival. So it actually diverts energy away from digestion, and your stomach empties slower, your intestines work slower to process food. What this does is actually cause bloating and discomfort, and it also means you absorb less nutrients. So someone with elevated cortisol may also have lower calcium, magnesium, vitamin B, and these deficiencies, they all lead to their own issues with health. What you'll also find though is when cortisol is elevated, appetite actually increases, and so do your cravings. And this is quite simple to understand if you know what's going on. If you're in a state of stress, I just went through all of the things that your body does to prioritize energy. Break down muscle, increase glucose, increase your heart rate to fuel your muscles with oxygen in case you need to sprint or fight someone. And all of these processes that I've just went through, they do actually take a bit of energy. They put some strain and stress on your body, and quite naturally your body wants you to refuel, so it's going to make you hungry. The issue is with elevated cortisol levels, this is a chronic state, so you keep having this cycle go on. You'll always be feeling hungry because your body is in such a state of stress. And those cravings for sugary foods, they increase again because sugary foods, your body sees that as pure glucose. That's pure energy. It's a hit of energy that your body keeps thinking it needs, when in reality, it doesn't need it at all. Now, it's not just digestion and appetite that gets impacted. Your gut bacteria also get disrupted. And I know I haven't talked much about gut bacteria on this channel yet, but when gut bacteria has an imbalance, you can get issues with irritable bowel syndrome and experience symptoms like constipation, diarrhea, bloating, gas, pain, and discomfort. And these are actually very common symptoms that many people experience, and they may not link it to elevated cortisol. So that is just something to think about if you are someone having such issues. But the last thing I wanted to mention is that your immune system will be impacted by cortisol. And this is because it reduces how much white blood cells that your body makes. Now, white blood cells, they are your immune cells. They fight off infections. And again, if cortisol is always around and always elevated, this isn't a priority because it doesn't provide you with immediate energy. And so if this becomes a chronic long-term problem, then you have less white blood cells around to protect you and you become a bit more susceptible to getting sick. So if you are someone who finds they keep getting sick with colds and flus, maybe your cortisol levels are elevated. And honestly, I should probably take my own advice here because for the past year, that has been me. Now, I will admit the only thing I haven't really mentioned here is hormones. And cortisol, being a hormone itself, can cause disruptions to others when it is elevated. A notable thing would be with the reproductive hormones. So this would be testosterone and estrogen, which are very important for the menstrual cycles in women, but also fertility. So if fertility is something that is important to you, making sure your cortisol levels are not elevated would be a priority and something to think about. So I think the moral of this video is that stress impacts every single system in your body. Nothing is safe from it. And I know it's all well and good for me to say, don't cause any stress to your body. It's bad for you. This isn't new knowledge. But as I said in the beginning of the video, our lifestyles themselves are creating conditions for this to happen. Changing lifestyles quite literally means changing your life, which I do understand is not a small task. And that's why I will always say small changes over a long period of time. Start with one thing, make that happen, focus on making that happen, and then you can move on to the next. I did mention in one of my previous videos that it actually takes close to 100 days for a habit to form in reality. So don't get discouraged. These things take time, but starting as soon as you can is the best way to go about it. I'm going to be starting to make videos on how exactly you can make these changes and what you can do to make small lifestyle changes to benefit your health soon, because they're things that I want to do myself, and so I'll be trying to see how I can fit it in my life and share that with you. I've spent most of my time so far doing more informative videos, but I do want to start giving some actionable information too to help those of you that are unsure where to start, because you can consume as much information as you want, but if you aren't making those changes, all of that means nothing. So keep an eye out for those in the future. They're probably a couple of months away because I'm moving house soon. But if you want me to expand on anything from today's video, let me know in the comments, but I'll see you in the next video, and until then, keep playing the long game.